Today we're going to talk about rational numbers, and at the end of this lesson you should be able to write equivalent fractions and decimals. So let's begin with what is a rational number? Well, if you think back to the concentric circles that we created, a rational number is any number that can be written as a fraction. So let's give some examples of rational numbers. So rational numbers could be, of course, if they can be written as a fraction, could be fractions. 1/2 is a fraction, it's a rational number. You could write the number 3 as a fraction by putting it over 1. The numbers 0.75 can be written as 3/4. So that's also a rational number. 1/3 is the same thing as 0.3 repeating, so repeating decimals are also rational numbers. So now let's talk about some different types of rational numbers and how to find them. So the first one we want to talk about is a terminating decimal, and a terminating decimal is exactly what it says. It's a decimal that terminates, or another word for that is a decimal that ends. For example, if I take 0.25, that's the same thing as 1/4, so it's a rational number, but it ends, it stops at 0.25. 2/3 is 0.66666666 forever and ever and ever. That's a rational number, but it is not a terminating decimal because it doesn't end. It goes on forever and ever and ever. So a terminating decimal is what it says. It's a decimal that ends. Let's look at some examples of some determine if they're terminating or not. So let's look at the example of the first one. It says write 1 3/8, 138 over 150 as a decimal. So in order to do that, we want to take our calculator and we want to divide the numerator by the denominator. Just like you would if this was a test grade and you wanted to figure out what your percentage was, you take the 138 and divide it by 150. So if I take 138 divided by 150 on my calculator, I get 0.92. Is that a terminating decimal? Well, it doesn't go on forever, it ends, so yes, it is terminating. Now, if I take 12 divided by 11, I get 1.09090909, etc. And my 09 repeats. So when I write it, I draw a line over the 09. That's a repeating decimal. Whoops. And it goes on and on forever, so we would not count that as a terminating decimal. So we talked about a repeating decimal in the last one with 12/11ths. So what is the definition of a repeating decimal? Well, a repeating decimal always has at least one or more digits that repeat. My computer doesn't want to work here today. Here we go. One or more digits that repeat. Make sure you're defining these in your notes because you will be responsible for them later. So let's look here. If I take 27 ninths and I want to change that to a decimal, so I take 27 and I divide that by 99, I get 0.27272, etc., etc. So the digits that are repeating are 2 and 7, so I put a line above those. That's a repeating decimal. Now 55 over 60, if I take 55 and I divide it by 60, I get 0.916666, etc. So the number in this problem that repeats is just the 6. So I'm going to write 0.91 and then 6, and the line only goes above the 6 to let everybody know that 6 is the only digit that's repeating. Now, what if I want to write an equivalent fraction? Equivalent meaning what? Equivalent is the same thing as equal. So I want to write a fraction that is equal to 1.345. So we want to write that as a mixed number because it's over 1, so we're going to write it as a mixed number. So this is my whole number right here, so it's going to be 1 and 345. Now, I have to figure out, is that tenths, hundreds, thousands, billions, trillions, whatever. So the trick to doing this is to take a line and put it under the number and put a 1 in the ones place. So it doesn't matter what your whole number is. You always put a 1 in the ones place. And then fill in a 0 for every number that follows. So it's 1 and 345 thousandths. So if you can't remember that, that's your little trick. Now, if I simplify that, I can simplify that to 1 and 69 200ths. And to simplify that, I look at these two and I can see that they are both divisible by 5 because they have a 5 and a 0 at the end. So if I take 345 and I divide it by 5, I get 6 goes in, drop down the 5, and then 9 goes in. And same with 1,000. If I take 5 into 1,000, it goes in twice, and then 0, and then 0. So I get 69 over 200, and that's in simplest form. So I had a decimal and I changed it to a fraction. Let's look at the next one, 1 and 42. So my whole number is 1, and I have 42 over, so put a 1 in the ones place, and a 0 for each additional digit, hundreds. Now simplify. I look at the last two digits. They're both even, so I know this is at least divisible by 2. So don't forget to bring the 1 over. You don't lose that. So half of 42 is 21, and half of 100 is 50. Then I look at 21 and 50. There's nothing that can go into both of those evenly, so that's my final answer. Now let's look at what we have learned. At this point, you should be able to change a decimal to a fraction. And you should be able to change a fraction to a decimal. You should also know what terminating, decimals, repeating decimals, and what are rational numbers. Those are the vocabulary words you need to know. So to change a decimal to a fraction, so if I have 1.23, okay, you write it as a fraction, so your whole number comes first, and then your decimal part, you get 23 hundredths, and then simplify, which is already simplified, and then change a fraction to a decimal. Say you have 12 over 50. You divide the numerator and the denominator, and that's your answer. This one would be 0.24. Make sure that you copy these notes into your scaffolded interactive notebook, and that the what we have learned should be at the bottom in your summary section.